So this is part 2 to a video that I put up yesterday. We ran out of time and I wanted to actually spend a little bit more time with the video. So we're talking about what a forensic investigator is going to look at around the body when he finds the body. So everything, when you're dealing with insects, when you're dealing with the body, it has to be recorded very carefully, especially for insect material, which honestly, it can be really hard to find. So when approaching a scene with insect evidence, you have to consider the surroundings. If the scene is outdoors, you got to note the landscape, what type of plants are there, what type of soil types, as well as what's going on in the weather, because all that can affect what's going on with the insects. The temperature is especially important. If possible, a portable recording device is left to record long-term changes. You got to take a soil sample, since larvae may wander away from the body to pupate. And if the scene is indoors, the investigator has to look at access points. Where can the insects get in? Once at the body, the forensic entomologist takes several samples from different areas of the body. You can guess where, those lovely openings. If there are maggots, some are collected and placed in a boiling water, poor little maggots, and preserved in alcohol. This stops the development and allows the insect to be aged in order to figure out how old it is. Once the maggots are collected alive, other maggots when you get alive and they can be kept until they reach adulthood. At this stage, the species can then be determined. So you got to figure out what they are. Normally, eggs are only collected if there are no later stages associated with the body. Again, some are taken and preserved in alcohol, while others are watched until they hatch. And then, of course, those empty pupal casings are also collected. Adult flies are only useful if the wings are crumpled. This suggests they've recently emerged and can be linked to the body. Otherwise, they are very useful since they may have just arrived on the scene. But in any case, they may be collected to estimate the fauna. So the careful and accurate collection of insect evidence at the scene is exceedingly important. Ideally, an entomologist collects a load of different insect stages from different areas of the body and surroundings. Different species or insects are collected from different areas, and they all are kept separate. Alright, so here's some information about flies and beetles and eggs and how they lay their eggs and what's going on with them. Feel free to stop the PowerPoint and take a look at this. So you got maggots here and where you can find them and some information about their different stages. And those lovely pupae and their empty pupal casings, which we already talked about how a lot of these actually are really hard to find because they look like stuff that might be left over from, say, mice or rats or cockroaches. So other information that's important, the habitat, woods, beach, house, that's going to indicate what insects may be around. Is it shady or exposed to light? Once again, what type of insects are going to kind of hang out there? What type of vegetation, the trees, the grass, the bush, the shrubs, soil type, the weather, temperature and humidity, elevation, and odd information, like whether or not the body was submerged. Other things you need to know, the type of clothing that's there, how much of it is, was the body buried or covered? If there's an obvious cause of death, hey, it's missing the head. If there are wounds in the body, blood and fluid at the scene, obvious maybe like stab wounds. If the drugs were involved, because drugs can affect decomposition rates. Well, how was the body left? Is it on its side, stomach, back? Which direction the body was faced? How far along is this decomposition? Any other carrion hanging out there? And if the body was disturbed. So at the laboratory, the entomologists get in there and they measure and examine immature specimens, placing them in a jar with sawdust and food. The insects are checked frequently, and when they pupate, they are removed. The date of the pupation and the emergence is noted for each specimen, and when the adults emerge, they are killed and stored. This process is important because adult flies are much easier to identify to species than larvae. Also, pupation and emergence times are used to calculate the age at the time of collection. Forensic entomology is used commonly to determine time since death. However, it can also give some more information. So, examples: insects can provide details about a person's life before they died. Because development is predictable depending on species-specific factors. The use of drugs can change the life cycle. One such drug is cocaine, which causes the maggots feeding on the affected tissues to develop much faster than they normally would. Insect behavior can also offer clues about the time of death. Flies tend to lay their eggs first in moist places in the body like eyes and mouth. If eggs or maggots are found normally dry skin like the forearms before other areas, it suggests the skin was damaged in some way. In other words, there's been maybe a cut, or maybe the skin is off. This may be because the individual injured themselves in a fall, or because they were trying to protect themselves from a weapon. In either case, an important piece of evidence has been discovered. And finally, the species of insects can point to events that occurred after death. For example, if some insects are found only in some areas, if a species that is normally found only in the countryside is found at the scene in the city, it suggests the body has been moved to some point after death. And once again, this gives a very specific type of information. All right, here's a list of what insects can tell you. Some nice and basics here. Here's some information about estimating postmortem interval. Feel free once again to stop the PowerPoint to take a look at it. You guys aren't going to worry about calculating the PMI. There's really from insects, there's really no way for me to manage to get you to do this remotely. So if you have an interest in it, feel free to take a look at it, but we're not going to be worrying about it right now. And here's information about determining whether the body has been moved. And we talked about knowing whether an area is shady or sunny. You can see that some of these guys like shady areas in the city, some like shady areas in the forest. Sometimes some of these guys like open habitats and bright sunshine. Sometimes they prefer the fall and the spring and cold weather. So you can see determining what insect is hanging out where can give you a load of information. Killers oftentimes will return to the body, so if you find disturbance with the insects, you might know that there's been disturbance to the body. Position of wounds and presence. Blowflies like to lay their eggs close to wounds. In advanced decomposition, atypical or irregular colonization patterns can indicate wound sites. And a pathologist can come in and identify a wound and what weapon caused it. Insects feeding on human tissue can absorb a lot of odd substances like drugs and poisons. If toxicology doesn't work on the victim, analysis of the insects can identify the toxin. So with cocaine, high doses can accelerate the development of some sarcophagids. An insecticide called malathion, often used in suicide, can delay the colonization of insects in the mouth. Particular antidepressant here can prolong the development time up to 77 hours on one species. Insects living on a living human or animal do no damage, but can help clean wounds. Actually, believe it or not, back in the old days, if you had a wound and there was a lot of problems with it, maggots often were applied to it to eat the dead tissue, which can cause a lot of issues. Sounds disgusting, but true. Presence of insects can show the length of abuse and neglect. If there's some found in a wound. This has actually been shown sometimes, like in old folks' homes, where they'll find maggots in a wound, showing that maybe that there's been neglect in a patient. Maybe they actually have bed sores and they haven't been cleaned, and they'll find this type of stuff in them, and it shows neglect. There are limitations, guys. The time of death estimates depend on accurate temperature information, but local weather patterns can be variable, and data may come from stations quite distant from the crime scene. It relies on insect abundance, and in winter, not so much. It takes time to rear insects, so you can't get immediate results. And treatments like freezing, burial wrapping can exclude insects that can affect estimates. And chemicals, once again, as we see, can slow or accelerate growth. And here's information that can influence insect succession on carrion. All right, there are a lot of factors that influence insect succession on carrion. In other words, how are they attracted to the dead body? So there are a lot of things you look at. Odor is one of them. In South Africa, mark flies of the genus Crasioma were caught up to 60 kilometers away from their point of release. So they were smelling the dead that far away, which is crazy when you think about it. So vision and color also play a role in finding the remains. Oviposition is elicited primarily by the presence of an ammonia-rich compounds, as well as moisture, pheromones, and tactile stimuli. The remains also appear to be more attractive once one female has begun to lay her eggs. It's kind of like, a place is always more attractive when someone is already there. So a bunch of them actually start popping in once already one fly starts. This may be an evolutionary strategy to minimize desiccation and predation during the egg stage, which eventually results in large numbers of maggots in the body. And large maggot masses also can break down a body faster. The size of the carcass also seems to be to affect its attractiveness to blowflies. So larger carcasses tend to be better. All right, here's some biology about flies if you have an interest in it. Some geographical differences in succession. Season also often plays an important aspect of it, along with the plants and animals in the region. For instance, in Mississippi, one particular type of fly is more dominant in warmer summer months from April to September, while another type is more dominated in the winter months. And some are found throughout the year. In a study of 117 human deaths in Japan, distinct seasonal differences were seen in blowfly colonization, with only one species, C. vicina, being found all year. There's some issues here about sun exposure and habitat preference, whether or not something is in the shade or whether or not something is in the sun. And urban versus rural areas. Some like the city, some like the country. And once again, bodies found inside buildings. A lot of police and general public actually believe insects won't colonize the remains inside a building, but yes, they will. Easily as indoors and as there are outdoors. Insects will even be found in high-rise apartments. In Germany, numerous flies were collected inside a multi-level apartment building. In one study, 3 freshly killed pig carcasses were placed inside 3 different rooms in a house, and a further 3 freshly killed pigs were placed outside in a grassed area. The indoor carcasses were placed in the living room, bedroom, and bathroom, respectively. 2 windows in the house were open but screened, with a small hole in the mesh and one screen. Indoor mean temperature for the duration of the experiment was around 17.8 degrees Celsius, and outside was about 16.4 degrees Celsius. Outside, the flies were attracted to the remains within minutes of placement, and eggs were laid immediately. Indoor, no flies or eggs were found on the remains until 5 days, but they got there. One thing they did find is decomposition would proceed more